I'm not an art historian, but I'm a historian, and the reason that you're going to hear about alcohol and wine in particular today is that already 10 years ago I published my dissertation on the wine and brandy trade between France and the Dutch Republic in the 17th century. So art history is a secondary field, but has always been a very close secondary field for me. And as you will see from my talk, the blend of art and history, you can make it pretty close if you find the right images. Since 2007, I've had the incredible privilege to work with Arthur Wheelock in the Dutch and Flemish, I should say, department of the National Gallery, and I continue to learn. People say, "What a great job you have." My reply is, "That's not a job; it's just sheer enjoyment." So, I have a further confession to make. My interest in alcohol may stem from a genetic background. Some of you have recognized this gentleman, Cornelis Witsen, who 11 generations back is a great, etc., grandfather of mine. And when he died in 1669, somebody wrote down, this was a gentleman who was too partial to tall glasses, i.e. he drank too much, and as I'll go into it a little bit later, he died of dropsy, which is also related to chronic alcoholism. But anyway, that's Opa. And some people say I actually look like him. So. But apart from persistent alcoholics, how much wine and beer did the Dutch drink? What about all the milk? What about all the cheese? So, to what extent is this image correct for what people were drinking? Contrast to a family clearly in its own home partying like there's no tomorrow. There's a parrot on the stand, and so we have two completely different visual images that might tell us, okay, so what are the Dutch people drinking in the 17th century? And do the genre paintings that we have in the exhibition currently, what do they tell us? Is there evidence? So first of all, wine is a want. It is not a need. So that already brings it into the realm of luxury, spendable income. It's not something you need. But it clearly was a luxury product, and the reason that it comes into to the fore in a lot of Dutch high life genre paintings, I think is twofold. Wine itself was an emblem for affluence, but also which genre painter, which artist, if he were any good at all, wouldn't insert a glimmering glass of a translucent liquid in one of his paintings, just showing off his or her skills. In combination, in this case, in the girl eating oysters, with the incredible cloth and fur and the oysters and the glimmer of the metal. So a glass of wine was just a great object to include in a painting, showing off your stuff, strutting your stuff. Here are some of the glasses that they might have painted. And it is too hard to read from the image, but the glass on the left has two couples in close contact, shall we say, and one has underneath it, "I do it for love," and on the opposite side, the couple has underneath it, "I do it for money." On the glass. It was not my quote, it is on the glass. And the one on the right-hand side has Bacchus, the wine god, on a vessel. And again, we have typical wine glasses, a rumor for wines from the Rhine and the German river valleys. This is what they call a pass glass. If you see the lines, the trick was there was one glass for the company, and you had to drink exactly to the next line. But if you missed your mark, you had to chug the whole thing. So this was one big party, if you missed it. and a silver beaker. Again, why include it in a still life? Were those glasses actually on that table? Probably not, but it was great to juxtapose the stubby glass, the tall glass, the silver beaker in a genre painting. So it looks real, it looks like somebody stepped away from the table, but it is, in most likelihood, it is a complete construct. Limited or no drinking in high life genre paintings. If you go to the Vermeer and the Masters of Genre Painting exhibition, or you have already been inside, there are quite a few paintings that have nothing to do with alcohol. And if you start to think about it, now these people all happen to be writing letters or writing notebooks. They don't have anything to drink next to them on the table. My interpretation of that is, on the job, the Dutch did not drink. You don't see them in market scenes chugging away. You don't see them in the house when they're doing their needlework, chugging away. Drinking was reserved for when you ate or when you got together with your friends. Unlike today's society, where if you go from the living room to the kitchen, you need to bring your water bottle with you. But that's just a little aside. So, in daily life, when you were at your tasks, I don't think there was much drinking going on. However, I'm not arguing at all that the Dutch were teetotalers. And one very beautiful example with a horrible slide, because the image file is not big enough, but the dropsicle woman. So here's a woman being attended to by a doctor, and he's checking her urine, and the girl is crying over her mother. And the title gives it away, because dropsy comes from the French hydropsie, which comes from the Greek hydro, water. So this is a woman who has congestive heart failure, which makes everything swell up. She has edema, I think I pronounce it correctly, which is one of the results of cirrhosis of the liver caused by excessive drinking. And why do we know that that is the cause of all her medical trouble? We have the vine sticking through the window, and we have the cooler with wine standing in the corner. So, at first you think somebody slapped the title on this painting, willy-nilly, dropsicle is a fancy name, let's put it in. But if you then start to combine the little signs, it makes perfect sense. And this is also the illness that great-grandpa Whitson died of. That is also recorded. In Dutch, it is a very nice word. It is called water seeking, that your body just holds too much water. Anyway, so they did drink, and they did drink to excess. However, she is at work, or at least at practice, and I first thought she was a good example of somebody being hard at work and no alcohol inside, until you really start to go close, and there is a glass of red wine behind her. But she's not drinking while she is playing, and her water cooler is ready. So is she getting ready for a party? Most likely, because here she or her sister, I'm making this up obviously, is playing while in the background a very festive gathering is taking place with a incredible tall glass. I don't know if the slide is good enough from where you are, but he is pouring liquid in another glass right here. I think she is holding a glass, but that's hard to tell. It's really in the distance. This is one of the paintings that is in the show, so you can go check it out yourself. So, long story short on this part is that the Dutch seem to have been social drinkers. So they were not teetotalers, but they drank when they got together with their friends. I will take a little detour toward beer, because beer is a need in the 17th century. Water, no, I'm not joking. I mean, it sounds like, hey, we're all drinking beer. But think about it. The quality of the water in most cases was so incredibly bad that you needed to have something in your glass that had been boiled. So even very low alcohol beer, the equivalent of Budweiser, I always think, would be served to children as well. So you had lots of breweries churning out lots of beer, and here we have a nice little illustration of not a girl drinking beer, but she's actually eating her porridge. Think about the milk again. Eating her porridge, and the dog is hoping for a little tidbit. Beer is a staple, and I will show you a slide in a few seconds that shows you exactly how much beer they produce. Now, this one, and now we get into a little bit of art history. So, this beautiful painting by Adriaan van Ostade. And okay, so here's the older gentleman, and he's leaning over the chair, and then you say, wait a minute, I've seen that face before. And this is The Old Drinker by Gabriel Metsu. And I think this gentleman here is the same gentleman as this gentleman, especially because of the funny-looking, fur-trimmed red hat. Can you make out what the mark on the beer barrel is? You see this red thing? That's an image of a red stag. So this was beer that came from the Red Stag Brewery. Now we know that Metsu in 1950 lived right next door to the Red Stag Brewery. So this was probably the guy he drank beer with every Friday afternoon. And the slate with all his glasses, I think there are 4 or 5 notches on it, or stripes on it. He has been there for a while that night, I think. So Red Stag, and so you start to research the Red Stag Brewery. And here we have the vegetable market on the Prinsengracht, which is, by the way, also the topic of another painting by Metsu that used to be in the Metsu show here. But lo and behold, on the water reservoir of the brewery, we see the Red Stag. And why does a brewery have a water reservoir along the quayside? The canal water, you didn't want to have any beer made from canal water. The water for the beer was barged in from places where they did have clean water. So that water was lifted up into the reservoir by the crane, and then this almost horizontal channel ran straight into the brewery, and that's how the brewery got its fresh water. So Red Stag beer, all the breweries had their own mark, so if you're lucky enough to be able to make the connection, you can get confirmation that indeed something like that is real and not a figment of his imagination. So Metsu, in this case, paints at least a setting that is real, and the guy looks like such a portrait rather than a tronie that he probably is a figure that he knew as well. How much beer? I will only give you a few of these charts, but this one is kind of interesting because pretty much ignore the blue because that's an earlier time frame in the 1580s. But in the red era of the fiscal year 1654-65, the impost, the local municipal excise tax on alcohol brought in 91.5% of all the alcohol-related revenues in the city of Rotterdam. Wine brought in 7% and brandy 1.5%. So it's just a confirmation that wine was a luxury, even though it was a higher value commodity. And alcohol played a big role in municipal coffers regardless, because 49% of the income that year for the city came from alcohol revenues. So City fathers, I'm not saying that they probably promoted drinking, but I don't think they were too sad if people had another glass. How much could you spend on beer or wine? This is in 1631, a journeyman earned, and these numbers are, I'm not making these up, but of course this fluctuates if it's summer, if it's winter, but say 1.3 guilders per summer day, and 3.9% of that would buy the guy a liter of beer, or he could really splurge and 1/5 of his daily wages would go to wine. So you can, it's a little confirmation that they might once in a while go for a glass of wine, but a journeyman would rarely drink wine. But those people who had more money obviously did. So that was the story about beer, and now let's focus more on wine per se. I couldn't resist including this slide because Bacchus, no words are necessary. He's on top of a barrel, he's having a grand time. He has already had so much to drink that he's spilling it from his vessel, and he is ready to party. What about the history of getting wine into the Netherlands? Well, years ago I was in the town of Zierikzee in the local museum and saw this Roman-era stele altar that they dug out of the sands in the sea near Zeeland, in the province of Zeeland, at the mouth of the Schelde River, near sort of in between what we now know as Holland and Flanders, Antwerp. This is 2nd, 3rd century after Christ, or Common Era, I should say, and it is dedicated to a locally revered goddess. And in the stele we have a wine trader's boat with 7 casks of wine, and we know it's wine and not beer because here we have the grapes on their vineyards. So even in the Roman era, or I shouldn't say even, in the Roman era there was trade in wine coming from more southern regions up north to be traded and to be drunk. Where did the wine come from? Well, you can only make wine if you can grow the grapes. And you can only grow the grapes if the weather is mild enough and sunny enough that you get something that is edible. So the wine frontier was definitely below any of the area that the Netherlands were in. Not in the Low Countries. It was too cold, it was too wet, and it was not sunny enough. So all the wines would be imported. These are 2 calendar pages of the famous Très Riche Heure of the Duc de Berry. Beautiful little miniatures, and on the left in March they are pruning the vines, getting ready for the summer and the growing season. And here they are collecting the bunches of grapes. This guy is taking a little sneak preview. The donkey is carrying it to the vats. So this is 15th century, the viticulture, the growing of grapes for wine is widely in place all over Europe. So the wines came from not only France, the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, around the whole of the Mediterranean, and in the southern German river valleys in certain conditions on the southern slopes, or the slopes with southern exposure. But the Dutch like to go to the source of all this goodness. And in the 17th century, there's extensive proof, and the example that I have from my research around the mouth of the Loire River, the city of Nantes, they had a large group of Dutch merchants not only buying the wine, but also getting into the production process, bringing in expat labor, bringing in coopers to make new barrels that were up to their standards. And this beautiful drawing is by a well-known Dutch artist, Lambert Domer. His brother, Maarten, was a merchant in Nantes, and he visited his brother for about a year and a half and left a bunch of gorgeous drawings. So we always think, okay, in the olden days they just started stomping grapes, right, with their bare feet. Well, here you have a commercial wine press that can obviously process many more grapes at a setting. And here you see the liquid being collected in a little barrel. Beautiful drawing. They also talk about being smart. Initially, they brought cheapo white wine that was barely drinkable from France into the Netherlands, distilled it into brandy. And then pretty soon they figured out if they brought the brandy stills to France, they would do the processing, the distilling there, and then you only had to transport small barrels with high value liquid in it. So there's one record that in 1 year they imported 234 into Nantes, into the area alone. And it created a huge upheaval in the local processing market. But they were in it for the production and not only for the drinking. So once you had your wines in the barrels, you tried to race home as quickly as possible, because wines did not really last very long, and after a year most of them had totally gone bad. So when the new wine was ready, merchants gave premiums to whichever captain would be the first one to reach home port and deliver the new wine, because there, like the Beaujolais Nouveau, there was a premium at getting the wine to the Netherlands. But most of the time, once that hype was over and the first wine had reached, the wine fleet was precious enough to warrant a convoy from an armed warship. So there was a dedicated wine fleet sailing between French ports and the Dutch ports. You get to port, and not only do you have a dedicated wine fleet, but in the city of Rotterdam, in the man-made part of the harbor constructed and dug up in the early part of the 17th century, this is the wine harbor. So one whole harbor is dedicated to the house of the wine merchants, and if you look carefully at this little section, here you see the crane that helped lift all those barrels out of the ships. So the Wijnhaven in Rotterdam. Now I need to just go along with the flow. So we have the wine, it has safely arrived in port. Here's another image of the crane in a slightly later period. But here is the crane, and here is the wine harbor, and here is I think it's the shipwrights harbor. Once it is on land and you need to distribute your wine, roads were circumspect, so most of the deliveries, almost all of the deliveries, would be made by sled rather than cart. This was far more sure, and here we have another drawing by Lambert Domer of a couple of wine barrels being brought across the square in Amsterdam. So you deliver your barrels on the sled with your horse to your merchant or your local consumer, and then you need to lift it off, and here we have, in a slightly later image, two porters grabbing the barrel. And in a beautiful work that we have in our collection here, we have the same yoke and the same carrying of the barrels. Another barrel, somebody is sneaking out with a probably non-taxed bottle or pitcher of wine. But if you ever are in need of a drink and you don't know where to go, look for two barrel staves and a pitcher as a sign outside a building, and that's your signal that you are approaching a tavern. So there's even a little description by Jan of Jan Steen, who was a tavern keeper, that when he was interested in painting and he didn't want to be bothered with customer, he took his barrel staves and pitcher off his tavern and only hung it back up when he was getting ready to see customers again. So keep that in mind for whenever you're thirsty for a glass of wine. Now, I already discussed the importance for municipal treasuries of the alcohol impost. In order to figure out how much somebody had to pay, every town employed wine gaugers. These were highly trained people with mathematical and especially geometrical skills who, from the size of a barrel and using the specific marked off stave that they stuck through the hole, they could exactly calculate the amount of liquid remaining in the barrel, and each barrel would be taxed based on the exact content, and you would have to pay your impost. That impost voucher became like a little passport, and the barrel could be traded as a whole, or you could tap from that barrel. But without your impost voucher, you were actually smuggling. We know of one very famous wine gauger, Anthony van Leeuwenhoek, who features in our current exhibition as an astronomer on the left and as a geographer on the right. But most experts agree that this is most likely Anthony van Leeuwenhoek, who was a contemporary and fellow Delft citizen of Vermeer. He was appointed wine gauger in 1679. And it was a big treat a week and a half ago, as part of the celebrations for the start of the exhibition here. We had a visit from a Spanish scientist who last year or 2 years ago was able to purchase at auction a newly found microscope by van Leeuwenhoek, who was called, or is known as, the father of microscopy. And he brought it to the gallery, and here Dr. Camacho and his wife are posing with Arthur Wheelock. And this little thing in the box is the microscope, and in reality it is literally no bigger than 2 inches. I won't go into details how you use it, but look it up. And just a little aside, it was a treat to see something this tiny that has survived. I think it was found in the mud when they were dredging a canal in Delft. So absolutely amazing. So that's my little side trip on Anthony van Leeuwenhoek. So van Leeuwenhoek and his fellow wine gaugers made sure that everybody paid their taxes, but you couldn't be everywhere at the same time. So smuggling was rampant. Of course, when you evaded taxes as a tavern keeper, you could lower your prices, and therefore you could bring in more people to your tavern because your wine and beer was cheaper than that of your competitor who did play by the rules. We have one document of a couple of Rotterdam wine merchants who want to check out the competition, and they go undercover to nearby Dordrecht, and they visit an unlicensed house where there are so many people drinking in this unofficial tavern that they couldn't find a place to sit. So no taxes, lots of drinking. Another tavern, I think it was a proper one, the publican admitted to the 2 gentlemen that he did serve wine that had not been taxed. And he said, but I don't want to have too many people come to my place because then the revenuers are going to pay attention and I'm going to get busted. So I'm paraphrasing. But these are 2 known cases that were written up at the time. So there is this constant back and forth between paying taxes, avoiding taxes. So what kind of evidence do we have of monies, of values, and of types? Unfortunately, the image is of horrible quality. The Dutch, at least of the Economic Library, have not updated their website. So this is what is known as a price current or a course of negotiation, which is a weekly price list printed at the behest of the Amsterdam burgomasters, listing all the commodities that are available on the market in Amsterdam at that week. And the prices are then printed and listed here. And this here, this is Spanish wine, French wines. So we have the size of the barrels, if it's new wine, if it's old wine, and here's a little outtake, Spanish wines, French wines. From the era 1609, 1682, we only have 75 of these lists that managed to survive. But from that list, we can tell exactly these wines were all on the market at some time. So both French and Spanish in different varieties. So it wasn't just French wine, Spanish wine, no. Which region, the better ones, the more daily ones, the brandies, and a wide variety of brandies as well. So by using these price currents, you can really get a sense of the flow of the market, of the imports of wine on the market. Disappearance from the list, if the printer doesn't include it for a couple of years, can mean two things. Either the wine is just either not drinkable or people weren't interested in it, or there's a war going on and there's an embargo with France, and therefore suddenly all the wines on the list or that are on the market are Spanish. But there are also moments when you're still fighting the Spanish, and in those periods, there's a lot of French wine on the market. The moment that the war ends, suddenly the wines appear again on the list, which can only mean that French wine, when it was under embargo, was listed as Spanish and vice versa. Because it was a barrel, so somebody says, no, this is Spanish wine. People say, yeah, of course. How can you tell? So you needed to know your wines even then, and you needed to know whether somebody tried to sell you Spanish wine, but in reality it was French. But in general, clearly the better wines were more expensive, and we have one beautiful case in which a bride-to-be and her brother visit a wine cellar of a merchant, and they taste test the wine, and end up purchasing a quarter of a large cask. Oxhead was a quarter cask, 60 gallons of a pretty upscale French wine. Now, this is not the bride, but we can all think it is, because it is a very elegant lady and a man testing wine. So why not project the story onto the beautiful painting? I thought, what is going on here? But it is a siphon. If you needed to siphon a quarter of a barrel into a smaller barrel, you needed to get it started, and that's what that is. So it's a gorgeous painting, and it gives us a little insight in what happens in these cellars. Now, wine merchants were called in for arbitration purposes. If there was a dispute over is it or is it not high quality wine. Most of the time it worked, but there's one beautiful example of two French guys who are asked to pronounce a verdict on a shipment of wine, and their verdict is it's slootwater, which is it's ditch water. So their expertise did not help the merchant trying to get rid of his ditchwater wine. Some of the things we know about consumption and trying to avoid taxation are from failed attempts. One case, the impost officials arrest a woman who leaves a house with a pitcher of wine that she had no voucher for. And again, we can project the story onto this beautiful little dhow, where the woman is in the middle of filling that little pitcher. And a second case, a woman is stopped carrying a bottle of wine. Now, why is that remarkable? Until pretty much through the first half of the 17th century, wine in bottles was an absolute rarity. So pretty much all wine was kept in cask until it was consumed. But these are slightly later bottles. But here we have a case, it was 1627 when she was carrying that bottle and was arrested. These came from a shipwreck, and this is a glorious bottle in the Rijksmuseum. We know it's a wine bottle because on the seal, lo and behold, we've seen him before, is Bacchus on his barrel. And the inscription in the glass reads, "Wel proeft de wijn, tasty is the wine." So not only did they drink the wine, but they also spiffied up the bottles. And the fact that it has survived is fantastic. You were not allowed to sell wine directly from your cellars. So there's a case of a couple of guys who are getting together in the house of a wine merchant. They've bought a bushel of oysters and they are drinking wine, and they're sitting on the small barrels in the cellar, and then the impost officials come in search of illegal drinking. Now, it would have been illegal if these people had paid the merchant for the wine, but he is sitting there with his friends, and you can have a party in your own cellar with your friends, so the impost officials left without charging anybody. But the rule was that you cannot run a tavern in your wine merchant's establishment. But it's a great image of guys having a good time in their cellar. If you saw my little blurb, you saw this quote, and I think it's just glorious image of how did the English look at the Dutch. And the English ambassador says, these people have money, they're doing quite well, but they're so incredibly tight-fisted that they don't want to spend it on anything except for French wine and brandy. They are happy in their voluntary poverty, who would otherwise seem poor and wretched in their real wealth. 1672. So, how much did they drink? I don't think we'll ever know, but we do know from the many, many paintings that there was a lot of incredible drinking going on in beautiful vessels and everything, and oysters. Let's not forget the oysters. Similar water cooler that we've seen before with, this is a glass bottle, but this is a bottle that they would have brought to the merchant to fill up for the party. And our own Jan Steen, again, an outdoor session and a very happy group of people. She has an elegant little wine glass. There's another wine glass here. The jug is here, a little beer. So, yes, they did drink. But they also frowned on excessive drinking or drinking that got you in trouble. Upper-class students enrolled in the Latin school in Rotterdam spent so much time drinking and carousing and playing cards in a tavern that they ran into serious trouble. They ran up a huge tab, gambled, and then they first had to pawn all their clothes, but that wasn't good enough, so they started to steal, and they were caught. And only the intervention of the schoolmaster prevented a worse punishment, apart from the fact that they were expelled from Latin school. Now, carousing and card playing normally did not lead to any of the law catching you, but there are also indications that people did drink when they should not have. Because if you don't have a problem, you don't need a regulation. So the fact that you have a regulation of 1651 is clear proof that it needs to be regulated. Now, our beautiful Van Mieris, which was acquired last year, I'm not saying he was a known drunk, but he is a militiaman, probably in his guard room, having a tall glass with probably his commanding officer who has just left the room. So hopefully they were not on duty anymore. Militia companies did party hard. And this is probably the biggest party of them all, absolutely immortalized in 1648 after the signing of the Treaty of Munster, which was the end of the 30 Years' War. The militias no longer had the function of safeguarding the city from foreign marauders. And the party is going on like crazy. So these are, the previous one is a militiaman. He's not supposed to drink on the job. And here we have a banquet that is the mother of all drinking banquets, with lots of beautiful glasses. 1, 2, and here this is really fancy with a holder. We have the ubiquitous cooler with a fancy wine container, and lo and behold, none other than my opa is holding the biggest drinking horn ever. He was the captain of the militia company at the time. And of course, if you flip back to the overall one, he gets place of honor, but it also happens to be the biggest drinking horn, which you can still see in the Amsterdam Museum if you go for a visit. So this is the drinking horn of the St. George Militia Company. And the reason that it is a saint, and we're talking about Calvinist Holland, the militia guilds predate the Reformation upheavals in the Netherlands. So the guilds had patron saints that were patron saints. So St. George was still on his horse saving the maiden. So 1623, somebody writes a poem celebrating the commerce of Rotterdam and all the commodities that are being brought in, and one of them is wine. And it says, "Wine chases away sadness." And these pictures clearly indicate that people did drink wine, but the question remains, if you have 3 people in a little setting, why is only 1 glass present? Same as this one. The guy's holding the jug, but she's the only one drinking the beer. I think in this case, or in these cases, it is more the allegory of the alcohol rather than everybody is shown with their own little glass. So it is the idea of having a good time rather than a realistic thing. This one is in the exhibition, and I would love to know what she's thinking. So he's playing a lute and everything looks very, very tidy, but is she absolutely bored? Is she drunk? Or is she so smitten that her eyes have glazed over? I don't know. But it is a wonderful little vignette. And then, of course, the cat glaring at the dog. Does that have a connecting reason for their being in there? But it's another beautiful little still life vignette in a genre painting. So, conclusion. Dutch people did enjoy their wine. Now, unfortunately, the quality of the slide is bad, but The Wedding at Cana by Jan Steen has everybody drinking. And of course, you know the story of the Bible. Jesus turns water into wine, 6 jugs. And I was starting to think, if Jesus can turn water into wine and you're Dutch, how much water is there in the Netherlands? So there is a huge supply of potential wine out there. And Jan Steen this may be an inside joke of Jan Steen, because he was a very known drinker. So, but if your pitcher runs dry, it's too bad. But there's always next year's vintage. Thank you very much.